afternoon from the almost cloudy and warm Copenhagen. Welcome to the webinar Incorporating ESCOs in Nationally Determined Contribution, hosted by Copenhagen Center on Energy Efficiency. My name is Aris. I'm working as a program officer at the Copenhagen Center, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar. A couple of things before we move to the main content of our webinar. This webinar is going to be about 50 to 60 minutes long, including time for Q&A at the end. In case you cannot stay until the end or want to get back to our presentations, all the materials and the recording of the whole webinar will be available online in a few days. Before we start discussing about today's webinar, I would like to inform our attendees that we complied with the General Data Protection Act, also known as GDPR. This means that your personal data, such as name, email, workplace, is safely processed and stored, and all of your rights pursuant to the GDPR are respected. You have full access to the data being processed about you, and at any time you can request that inaccurate data be deleted or rectified. For access or further information, please contact the people that are presented here. A few things about the Copenhagen Center. The Center conducts research and advisory activities in the field of energy efficiency and serves as energy efficiency hub for the Sustainable Energy for All initiative. The Center has an established network of global, regional, and national partners with a broad range of stakeholders to help accelerate the implementation of energy efficiency activities. On a regular basis, the Global ESCO Network will be conducting webinars. All materials, including recordings and presentations from previous webinars, can be found on Global ESCO Network library under the webinar section. The material of today's webinar will be uploaded shortly, but until then, you can check the previous ones. Now, I would like to briefly introduce the speakers of today's webinar. Søren is working as a senior economist at UNEP DTU Partnership. He has a PhD in climate policy with experience from 10 years of service in the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Frauke is founding partner of NewClimate Institute. She has over 15 years of experience in climate and sustainable energy policy and international development, and she has led many projects for a variety of public and private sector clients, including bilateral and multilateral development agencies and banks, national governments, the European Commission, foundations, and companies. Finally, I would like to inform you that you can send us your question during the presentations using the dedicated icon, and we will do our best to answer as many as we can at the end. Please do not forget to mention the name of the panelist that the question is for. And that was from me, and I would like to give the floor now to Frauke.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon or good morning wherever you are from Berlin. Maybe just I will be giving you a short input presentation on the nationally determined contributions, a bit of the policy context at the international level. Before going into the presentation, maybe just a few words on who we are. NewClimate Institute. We are a policy think tank, climate policy think tank based in Germany, in Cologne and Berlin, as is my case. We're not for profit, founded in 2014, and currently roughly 35 international colleagues. We work on all topics around the international climate policy agenda, supporting many countries with the implementation of the Paris Agreement, with the NDC's long-term strategies, analytical work and conceptual work around the different topics on climate policy and the sustainable development agenda. We follow the negotiations at the UNFCCC level closely and are also connected to the various partnerships and bodies, etc., and are also associate members of the NDC Partnership. Now, I will talk maybe 15, 20 minutes, give you starting with the Paris Agreement and talking a little bit about the ambition mechanism, the NDCs, and how that all sits together. Then I'll be taking a look at where we are now with the NDCs globally and an outlook for this year. Go a little bit into what 1.5 degrees, so the Paris Agreement goal, what that means at the sector level. Also then paving the way for kind of more of a discussion on entry points for ESCOs, which is the topic of this webinar. Now, the Paris Agreement, this is probably known to most, if not all of you, but just to quickly recap, this was a groundbreaking agreement back in 2015, where almost all countries came together to agree on this very ambitious goal to limit global temperature increase to well below 2 degrees and take efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees following the recommendations from the scientific community. This means actually reaching net zero emissions in the second half of the century and then going negative thereafter. An important goal or part of the Paris Agreement also relates to finance and to agreeing on aligning all financial flows with the goals, with the temperature goal of the Paris Agreement. How this is done is through a process, a bottom-up process, which is referred to also as the ambition mechanism, where all countries are asked to submit regularly their contributions of how their contributions to combating climate change, the so-called NDCs. And these are meant to be updated every 5 years, showing at least the same, if not a higher level of ambition, so that we collectively reach our goal over time. The NDCs are framed by the long-term strategies or long-term low-emission development strategies, which countries were also asked to submit in 2020. Now, this, as we all know, due to the pandemic, has been slightly delayed to this year. So countries are now submitting their long-term strategies that set out how they intend to decarbonize over the next decades. This is a view on how these processes, like the planning cycles and processes, basically sit together. So we have the first NDCs were submitted back in 2015. Now we are kind of in the first submissions 2020, which, as I said, have been delayed slightly. And the 2020 submissions of the NDCs are meant to show activities up to 2030 at least, and then you have the submission 2025 and 2030 with prospects to 2040 and 2050. Now, ideally, and this is kind of from our perspective, ideally the NDC planning cycles, the 5-year cycles, are framed by a planning cycle on the longer term strategies, which should be an ongoing process. Where countries set out how they intend to go to zero over the course of the next decades, and the NDCs in an ideal world would then be informed by this long-term strategy to make sure that the two are aligned, and that indeed countries, but we also collectively at the global level reach the Paris Agreement goal. This is just a slide or diagram that kind of shows a little bit where we are and the ambition gap. You can see here the recommendations, the past global GHG or CO2 emissions, and the recommendations back in 2007 by the IPCC compared to the recommendations of the IPCC in 2018. And you can see that in 2007 the slope would have been rather soft to get down to zero. Unfortunately, emissions continued to increase over the last years, so that now kind of going down to coming onto a pathway aligned with 1.5 degrees is quite a challenge and quite a steep decline. It means that global emissions actually need to halve in 2030, and you can see on the top line that shows collectively the national contribution, so the NDCs as they stand now, and we can see here the significant gap between what is on the table at the moment and where we actually need to be to avert or avoid the most dangerous and irreversible consequences of climate change. Now, as part of the climate action tracker, which we as NewClimate are part of, we regularly assess the NDCs that are being put forward according to their contribution or in how far they're actually sufficiently ambitious to achieve the Paris Agreement goals. We don't assess all countries, as you can see here. The ones that only those that are colored, so mainly the major emitters and a few other countries. And you can see here, and this aligns with the previous slide that I showed, that most NDCs are not sufficient. Some of them are even critically insufficient, and only very few countries are actually on the pathway that is aligned or near aligned with what is said in the Paris Agreement. Now to this year, as I said, a little bit delayed because the COP last year was postponed to November this year. Countries are submitting their first round of new NDCs, and again, as part of the climate action tracker, we look at what the status of these updated NDCs is, how many countries have submitted, how many countries are intending to submit, and whether or not the new NDCs are actually more ambitious or not. And you can see here again, we don't look at all countries, but from what we can see, the good news is that quite a number of countries have already updated their NDCs or are intending to update, but by far not all of them are actually more ambitious and as such aligned with what countries committed to in the Paris Agreement. And some of those countries that actually do not increase their level of ambition in this round of NDCs are rather large emitters, such as Mexico, Brazil, Russia, and Australia. On the upside, we also see a lot of new drive for net zero gaining momentum. Quite a few countries that are now committing to climate neutrality in the longer term, and these include very large emitters such as China that came out with a statement last year, the US, who are back on the international climate stage, the EU, but also several other countries that collectively represent 73% of global emissions. And similarly, a lot of so-called non-state actors, so subnational actors. Here you see regions, so subnational governments as well as cities are committing to net zero, to climate neutrality. And this is a map that shows the different regions and cities that have done so, that we are tracking, and also the proportion of national population that is covered, let's say, under these climate neutrality targets. It's over 800 cities now globally, and over 100 subnational or regions that have done this commitment. And in addition to that, this is not shown here, many companies are also committing to climate neutrality. Now, what does climate neutrality actually mean? It is, I mean, as I said earlier, it is a huge, it is of course a huge challenge, because it means that all countries need to reduce their emissions to zero over the course of the coming decades. Different sectors decarbonize at different speeds. So there are sectors that, like the energy sectors, where the technologies are known, they're market ready, and they're easier, although of course that's still challenging, but still they're easier to decarbonize than other sectors, such as aviation, also in industry sectors, and also agriculture, where emissions are hard to abate, or impossible to eliminate. So some sectors, and that includes the energy sector, need to decarbonize a lot faster to compensate for others, and to allow emissions in other sectors still to happen. And of course, countries have different starting points. No? And under the UNFCCC general principle of shared but differentiated responsibilities, industrialized countries need to decarbonize faster to allow those countries that have emitted less in the past and have less ability to decarbonize to do this at a slower speed. And also, industrialized countries do have a recognized responsibility to support other countries in their decarbonization efforts. And yes, significant progress has to be made in the next decade. This decade is really critical if we want to avoid the most dangerous climate change. This NDC cycle is actually critical, because if we postpone action to the next one, or if we postpone ambition to the next cycle, it will just simply be too late at some point. And yes, obviously, it's a huge challenge that we are collectively facing in the next years. Now, this is just to illustrate a little bit the 1.5 goal, and these are very general kind of global benchmarks that we developed to get a better feel, let's say, a better understanding of what 1.5 degrees actually means, and what needs to happen. I've highlighted here the parts that relate to the building sector, as that's the sector I believe most of interest now to this discussion and to ESCOs. And 1.5 degree would mean a significantly accelerated renovation rate for buildings from, I think currently we're at 1% to 3 to 5% per year. It would also mean that all new buildings from now on would need to be zero emissions or near zero emissions. And this is just outlining kind of in the other sectors what we would need to do starting basically now. Now, looking a bit more at energy efficiency for 1.5 degree pathway, this is a very recent report that was published by IRENA, the World Energy Transition Outlook for 1.5. And here the role that is highlighted here that energy efficiency plays, which is on par with the role of renewables, contributing a quarter of emissions reductions in the sector. And also from this report, which I thought was also interesting just to highlight in the context of ESCOs and the opportunities that are presented, is the level of investment that would obviously need to be scaled up significantly. And I've picked out here again kind of the energy efficiency element and the different subsectors. And just looking at buildings, you can see that annual investments will need to be scaled up as of now, as of this year, by the order of, I think, nearly order of 7. similarly in the industry sector, and a bit less so in the transport sector. Looking again at the building sector, and I thought this may be interesting, interesting research that we did on global benchmarks for the building sector, where we looked at a set of different countries, the world average, but also different countries, and we looked at where countries are today, where they have come from historically with their emissions in the sector, and then benchmarks are where they would need to be, and you can see that in the differently shaded green green lines, where they would need to be in 2030, 2040, and 2050 to be on course with a 1.5 degree pathway. And you can see that some countries are quite far away. If you look at South Africa, the US, from this benchmark, and other countries such as Brazil have backslided, so their emissions are going in a different direction. But roughly speaking, generally, buildings' emission intensity needs to reduce by at least 90 to 95% by 2040 for residential and commercial buildings. Sorry, I'm having... and then similarly, and we did these global benchmarks for a number of sectors. I just picked out buildings and the electrification of industry because I thought that might be of most interest. We also looked at renewables and the transport sector. And here similarly, you can see the benchmarks, looking at where different countries are today in their sectors now with the electrification of industry, and where they would, the ranges of where they would need to be to align with a 1.5 degree pathway. And globally, the share of electricity and final energy in industry would need to reach close to 50% by 2050. Now, moving a bit away from kind of these very brief snippets and insights into 1.5 and what that means for different sectors or energy efficiency in particular, looking a bit at planning processes and also potential entry points for ESCOs for the ESCO community. In terms of the planning processes, they're basically happening. Countries have I wouldn't say all, but in many cases, or at least from what I know, they have now set up quite formalized, or say, governance structures around NDC and LTS planning, usually headed by the ministries of environment, but involving the various line ministries through kind of interministerial planning processes and structures. There are those processes that are rather bottom up, so where the NDC is made up from different inputs that come from the different sectors on the different policies and targets, etc., and then they're aggregated into kind of a national target. There are other countries that take more of a top-down approach to have a national target that is then distributed to the sectors. But in any case, this integrated planning, at least from our perspective, there has been a lot of improvement, let's say, or a lot happening in making sure that planning processes across the different sectors, across the different planning streams, let's say, that are happening are more integrated, but there's still a need to reinforce that and to really make sure that all the different sector strategies, the national level strategies, subnational strategies and policies are really well aligned with the NDCs and then also the long-term strategy. And I think these planning processes, they're set up differently in different countries. Of course, there are different governance governance systems. But I think there is a lot of opportunity for actors outside of government, the private sector, business associations, etc., to engage in this process, either formally, that is done in many countries, but also informally. And many countries actively or governments seek the participation and the inputs, in particular from private sector stakeholders. Now, one key topic, of course, is finance and budgets and budget constraints, and this is obviously more pronounced now in the post. We're not yet in the post. Hopefully, at some point, post-COVID world. But yeah, I mean, budgets are more constrained than ever. Finance ministries, treasuries are hugely important in these climate policy planning and implementation processes. So engagement at that level on kind of finance plans, etc. I think is another important or relevant entry point. And then, of course, the whole spectrum of non-national, so the subnational governments, companies, cities, as I mentioned earlier, that have increasingly climate commitments and climate neutrality targets, and of course, energy use of buildings and facilities more so than at the national level, is within within their action range or their sphere of influence or direct influence, and hence a key to climate strategies and climate policies, and to the achievement of their targets. At the UNFCCC level, you can also see in the last years that non-state climate action and private sector stakeholders and actors and subnational actors have had increasing visibility. There are many different initiatives and platforms like the Global Climate Action Platform that brings together these non-state actors. And Race to Zero campaign that also includes the finance community, etc. So I think there are opportunities around these, around these international networks and processes, etc. To increase the visibility, of the potential that ESCOs present to drive climate action and cost-effective implementation. And then lastly, my last slide, just as a bit of a summary of what I just said. Obviously, urgent need to scale up global ambition and to halve emissions by 2030. And this cycle, as I said, the NDC cycle is critical to achieve the global goals. The decarbonization of the energy sector needs to happen faster. Energy efficiency is a very important element to enable full decarbonization, not least because it is a cost-effective, if not the most cost-effective mitigation measure. And the finance issue, that I mentioned. National governments face finance constraints, so cost considerations and co-benefits of climate action are key drivers for many governments. And yes, the entry points for ESCOs. I think there are several in the different planning processes, both at the national as well as the subnational level. And what I mentioned before, the opportunity to increase visibility of ESCOs and their potentials in the international space and in the different fora under the UNFCCC, for example. And with that, I close my presentation and hand over to, I believe, to Søren. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Frauke. So I'll just take over, and I will first of all thank you all for joining. It's a pleasure to be able to address, I think, two audiences here. One coming from the ESCO side, and one coming from the NDC community, if you will. My name is Søren Lütken. I'm chairing the Global ESCO Network, which we established not so long ago. Just a quick word on the Global ESCO Network. We were established in 2019, but we actually only commenced activity in the mid-2020. We are anchored in UNEP DTU Partnership, as Ari said further, that is where I'm working. UNEP DTU Partnership also hosts the Copenhagen Center on Energy Efficiency, and it's in that context that we have partnered with the Efficiency Evaluation Organization, which is focused on the measurement of energy efficiency potentials, to establish the Global ESCO Network. We were created to bring the ESCOs onto the global climate change agenda through a concerted effort backed by all existing ESCO associations. So we are, in fact, a network of networks. There are, as far as we have been able to count, 38 national and regional ESCO associations in the world. 29 of those have already joined the Global ESCO Network. And with that, we believe that we can actually raise a global voice to place the ESCOs on the international climate change agenda. And the idea, of course, today is to start the dialogue between the two spheres, the energy efficiency, the ESCO sphere, and the NDC sphere, and see if we can merge the two. We initiate research and policy advocacy in global and national fora. Well, that's at least our objective. And we are currently running a series of monthly webinars, and today is the fifth in the series we're running until December, until we set up a new plan for 20. Last year, we published our first publication with the specific title on what we are established for, namely to incorporate energy efficiency service companies in nationally determined contributions. You can find it on our website with this very long link here. I hope we can make that accessible more easily. Generally, we believe that ESCOs are the instrument that makes energy efficiency potentials tangible, that ESCOs have been overlooked in international climate change advice, and that ESCOs offer the best returns on any climate change motivated action around. And finally, that ESCOs in many cases, and that's very personal right now, I mean, it is generally a labor intensive effort that is required to improve energy efficiency, particularly in buildings. And for that, they offer great opportunities to build back better after COVID-19. When, as Frauke said, when we hopefully finally get to an after COVID-19 situation. And of course, that building back better with a focus on green and climate change. Our website is here, but I'm sure you can find it also in other contexts, at least on the Copenhagen Center on Energy Efficiency website or elsewhere. I should not dwell with this because Frauke has already shared this photo, which is turning iconic, illustrating the achievements of Paris 5 years ago or 6 years ago by now, almost. We are in the process of hopefully meeting the objectives that we set out to meet with that agreement. But it is not going very well, as also Frauke just shared. We are part of the team publishing the UNEP's emissions gap report every year. And from that last report, it is clear that we are already, with the plans, that was the two graphs that Frauke showed, we're already 15 gigatons short of the goals that we set us to meet the 2-degree goal, and 32 gigatons short of emissions reduction to reach the 1.5-degree goal. And even compared to the 15 gigatons goal, which is what countries have unconditionally promised to do, we are already 3 gigatons short of that. So it's really not going in the right direction. And if anyone hoped that the COVID-19 would be a start of emissions reduction, so far we have not seen that effect. And the recent numbers from IEA is that emissions are actually growing. I think it was by 1.5 billion tons in 2021. That's an estimate right now. So it is really not going in the right direction. You can also see that here, the emissions per capita on a global level, and not only is the global population growing, but the emissions per capita is also growing. And that is really the wrong way to go. Specifically on energy efficiency, IEA has recently published these graphs here, which illustrate the energy intensity of economies, namely how much energy is used to produce a given amount of GDP. And it has been on a downward slope for many years. In fact, it is sort of a dynamic effect of economic development. We are using, or technological development, we are using less and less energy per economic output, but it's rarely a result of dedicated energy efficiency policies. It's simply a question of technology growing ever more efficient. That rate has been slowing down. And this graph here shows that on average from 2010 to 17 over here, the reduction in energy intensity was about 2.3, 2.2% on average. In 2018, it was all the way down to 1.1, back to about 2% again in 2019. And then the green dots here show the weather adjusted actual improvement in energy efficiency. But the main point here is that it falls far short of what we need to do in terms of improving the energy efficiency of the global economy. That has to be 4% per year. So we are falling far short of that target if we want the energy efficiency investments to deliver their contribution to the global emissions reduction agenda. Another way to look at it, I'm going to throw a couple of graphs here at you. Here is an illustration of the usage of fossil fuels for energy production. I think we don't talk so much about it, in fact. Even when we talk ESCOs, we are normally focusing on the area here below the black line and not so much on the area above the black line. What is happening up here is all the fossil fuels that we are burning to create heat that we simply don't use for anything. We are pouring it out in the ocean or the river or wherever we're pouring it, cooling towers, but we do not use it for anything. ESCOs normally don't use this part for anything either. The only industry that is looking at this is the district energy industry that is using the waste heat from power plants and from industry. But that is not a very common technology applied, and ESCOs, in fact, do not apply it either. What we focus on is to improve the efficiency of this smaller part of the fossil fuel consumption, which we're burning in order to generate electricity, and use this part more efficiently. So maybe even the ESCOs are missing the point. At least there is significant potential up here, which is not really addressed by the ESCO industry. So concluding here, energy efficiency is very far from delivering on its potential. As I said here, when just on the supply side, we are already losing 50% of the energy that we have available. But even historically, when we're looking back at CDM and JI under the Kyoto Protocol, energy efficiency was only part of 11% of the projects. Only 11% of the projects were focused on energy efficiency. They represented 8% of the reductions, but 30% of the methodologies were related to energy efficiency. So this discrepancy means, or illustrates, there are tons of opportunities of emissions reduction through energy efficiency approaches. They apply in all kinds, all different sectors, at least in theory, but in practice, they do not. They are not adopted, and in those two carbon credit creating mechanisms, it was not a method or an approach of choice. We can also see currently in NDCs, energy efficiency is at least set to be a priority in 81% of the submitted NDCs. It turns mostly out to be a relatively generic mentioning of energy efficiency. ESCOs are in fact only mentioned by 2 countries, and those 2 countries are Palestine and United Arab Emirates. So of course that doesn't give the entire picture, and as Frauke also mentioned, there are other lower level, not lower in terms of quality, but lower level in terms of detailed focus on actions. We have so far, and I admit this is an incomplete analysis, but so far we have identified 6 countries that include ESCOs in enacted climate change related laws and regulations. And these are Andorra, Bangladesh, Bulgaria, Italy, Japan, and North Macedonia. As I said, there may be others, but it's definitely not a common focus, neither of the more detailed underlying policies and regulations. And I would like here just to illustrate the mismatch between that situation and where the Global ESCO Network currently is represented, or even where we have ESCO associations on the planet. The 38 I mentioned are those countries here that are marked with a color. I mean, those countries that do not have a color do not have an ESCO association. Those that do, the green ones are part of the Global ESCO Network. The blue ones are not yet part of the Global ESCO Network. But if you compare this with the number of the countries that are not only the countries, but also the number of countries that mention ESCOs in their NDCs or in other supporting laws and regulations, there is few that match. We can see an overlap in Italy and Japan and of course UAE, but otherwise there is no overlap. And so far, and we haven't completed that analysis completely, but in our dialogues with our ESCO associations, so far we have only heard from Japan that they are actually working on getting ESCOs adopted in Japan's NDC. Question is why? We can see that while most countries have specific policies and objectives, particularly on renewable energy, energy efficiency at scale is left mostly to dynamic effects. So and as I mentioned before, the general technological development, which has the energy intensity of the global economy gradually fall over time, but not sufficiently. And it seems to be mostly that type of energy efficiency that countries are depending on. I have, well, there are two possible explanations here. One, of course, is lack of priority. And I'm including here a graphic presentation on and I picked it from Chile's NDC, where you can see 6-7 different axes of initiatives focused on the energy sector that are to reduce emissions and, in fact, achieve Chile's quite ambitious goal of now peaking their emissions in this century and start a gradual reduction to net zero goal in 2050. If you look here where energy efficiency comes in, it comes in as priority number 6, but you would have done all kinds of initiatives in the energy sector before you reach the energy efficiency axis. And I usually use the comparison to a bucket with holes. You would normally, if you have a bucket with holes, you would normally close the holes in the bucket before you start filling water in it. That seems not to be the logic in the energy sector. You would start pouring water into the bucket and eventually consider to fix the holes later. It is, and I think it is the inexplicable experience from the energy efficiency sector over the past 30 years, that it is not a priority. The other, even if it's mentioned as priority in NDCs, the concrete action that we need to see in order to achieve the energy efficiency potentials is simply lacking. And one of the reasons for that could simply also be a lack of understanding of the ESCO business model. I will come into that here. It seems that ESCOs are legally and regulatorily overlooked in most countries. And that is a fact, even if their aims are congruent with most of the declared objectives of the NDCs. They focus on, well, actually they do not focus on reducing emissions. They focus on reducing energy consumption. But the side effect of that, of course, is to reduce emissions. Now, we see a few possible explanations. One, well, they are occasionally disliked, and that is because they are for profit, and they can actually profit from investing in other people's assets, and should they be allowed to do that? They are also commonly, or mostly in fact, just neglected. They're not mentioned, not considered in national policies. And in some cases, and that's maybe more in the industrial sector, their business model is sometimes considered odd or too good to be true. Are you telling me that you're going to invest in my plant for free, and eventually you're going to hand over your investment to me, and I don't have to do anything? It sounds simply too good to be true, but it is in fact the model, and somehow it looks too good to be true. And finally, also they are targeting a technologically fragmented market where single technology solutions thrive. And by that I mean that the number of technologies is so vast, as I mentioned before. 30% of the methodologies under the CDM and JI were focused on energy efficiency. So there are so many opportunities that can be exploited. Unfortunately, most of them are exploited just by applying one single technology, and that is not always the most efficient way to go about it. Point 1, 2, and 4 are oftentimes seen in energy efficiency policies and regulation. Third-party finance projects are specifically excluded from support programs, for instance. We see that many places where there is a grant program established, but they specifically exclude non-owners of the asset from benefiting from the grant support. What that in practice means is that you have owners of technology receiving a grant to improve their own installation with the limited expertise and experience they have in doing so, but they can get the grant for doing it, whereas an ESCO, which is a professional entity, cannot benefit from that program. They would have to do the same kind of investment and count on the profitability of the investment without the grant support. So in that way, you would have countries providing grants that compete with ESCOs that could do the same thing, but on a commercial basis. So that is one misunderstanding of how the ESCO business actually works. Another thing is that ESCOs are generally not mentioned in energy efficiency laws. Energy efficiency laws are focusing on reducing energy consumption on particular parts of the economy, mainly buildings, but ESCOs are never or very rarely mentioned as an instrument to do so. And as also mentioned just before, specific programs, grant programs, are commonly targeting single technologies. They're not targeting an overall energy efficiency model for, say, a building that combines a number of different technologies. We are currently mapping the legal and regulatory obstacles facing ESCOs. I mean, we being the Global ESCO Network, in order to establish a legal and regulatory barrier map for ESCOs. And we do that because, as I mentioned before, our aim is to address policymakers to inspire specific inclusion of ESCOs as a concrete element, instrument. And in order to do that, we need to illustrate where is it that the regulatory frameworks that they have influence over is standing in the way for achieving those efficiency gains that ESCOs could do without any grant support. So highlighting these barriers is a central activity and issue for us as a starting point to use also the ESCO network's member base to bring across this message to the global fora that we are addressing. Preliminary observations from our work: countries are regularly they're running these promotional campaigns, but ESCOs are in fact looking for something else. The definition of specific energy saving targets for public and private buildings is one. Specific legislation for public procurement is a second. And the creation of specific legislation for the operation of ESCOs is a third. None of these are commonly addressed by governments. So it underscores a lack of understanding of the benefits of letting ESCOs exploit the potential of energy efficiency on a commercial basis, rather than addressing the same potentials on a grant basis. So that is one central point. It also underscores that the ESCOs lack a focus of their own contribution in a climate change context. It is never or rarely a selling point for ESCOs that they actually contribute to emissions reduction. I think I'm running out of time here, so maybe I should just quickly skip through the last observations here from our research or our investigations into the regulatory frameworks, and then end, because we do not have the answer. I mean, we want to address the global fora that are working with climate change, and that is why we are addressing the NDC level, and that's also why we are very happy that we have Frauke on board today. And the opportunity, I think, should be used to simply raise a few questions here and debate among ourselves as well as with the audience. And I hope that Aris has questions already in the chat that we can include in the discussion here between Frauke and I, where I would at least like to look at these questions that I have listed here. But priority, of course, is questions from the audience. So Aris, would you take over? I would like to thank you for listening and hand back to our moderator. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Søren and Frauke, for the very detailed presentation. Now we are going to start the discussion and the Q&A session. So please use the dedicated icon that is located on the webcast and send us your question. And I will ask from Frauke and Søren to activate their web camera so our audience to be able to see who are today's speakers. Thank you very much. Hello. And so I think, Søren, you have some questions, and I'll start with you. I'll give the floor to you, and in order to have the discussion with Frauke.
So, I mean, as you also ended, Frauke, with your presentation, looking at the options that we may have as the ESCO community in influencing national policies in the climate change context. I'm wondering if engaging in the NDC process is in fact the right place to engage. And as you mentioned, they may be very generic sort of policy documents that might not be the right platform. What do you think? Is that the way we should go about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the NDCs themselves, they're quite high. They're often high-level documents. They're used for a specific purpose, which is to communicate, to the international community. But the way to get to these NDCs is usually a detailed technical and engagement and planning process. So it's not only the NDC, but what is all surrounding it and underlying it. And I do see many opportunities, for private sector actors, for associations to engage in these different processes that either lead up to the NDC or that go to implementation plans of the NDCs. And that's different. In some countries, they have specific formats where they allow private actors to participate actively. Others, it's more a consultation process. But I think there are plenty of opportunities that should indeed be used to make the, as you outlined, to make the potential visible, to that ESCOs present, because at the end of the day, countries have their commitments. They're looking for options and for cost-effective options to reduce emissions, and that seems to be one interesting part of the piece of the puzzle.
And there is no, well, as you say, these are country-specific processes. So there's not a common approach taken by countries, and there's not a common anchor where we could start penetrating those national processes.
I mean, the NDCs themselves, by their nature, they are bottom up and they're deliberately flexible, so that countries can choose the form and the way to present their commitments. And some they take different forms. Some are kind of national targets. Some are more action-based and also include details of implementation. I mean, there is a there's some converging consensus of what these NDCs should and could look like, but not a central kind of forum that structures that. But then there are these networks and initiatives, that I also mentioned under the UNFCCC, for example, or I mean, you also know the NDC Partnership and different kind of networks, initiatives, etc., that bring different types of actors together, and that I think is also an interesting avenue, for ESCOs to explore, or for the ESCO network to explore.
And how do you see the NDC partnership in that context? Is that a body that we can address or include in that process?
I mean, I think it could be an option for a network such as the Global ESCO Network to become an associate partner and also a member of the partnership, no? Because the whole purpose of the partnership is to bring together the different actors that play a role in delivering on NDCs, be it financing them, technical support, and the way they operate is driven by demands from their member countries where they see need for support, and then they take the demands for support to their network, which is many finance institutions, but also others such as us who work on more technical stuff, to see how the need for support, how the demand can be matched. And I could see there without well, I don't know. I mean, we're just associate members, but there could be a possibility and to engage at that level, or then it's again the countries that are members of the partnership who formulate their demands for support for implementation, where there could be a potential entry point also.
Okay, excellent. But I'm sure we will try to pursue that angle as well. Aris, are there any other questions in the chat? Otherwise, our time is up as far as I can see.
We received questions, but we're running out of time. But if I may, if you have a little bit of time, I would like to make a question that we received from the audience. And the question is, ESCOs are generally aware of energy efficiency measures. How far they are aware of NDCs?
I wonder, I guess that's a question for me. And I would generally say that we are trying with this to combine two worlds apart. There is not much concern or consideration of NDCs among ESCOs. As I mentioned before, the only ESCO association that we've heard is focusing on NDCs is Japan. I will not exclude that there are others. But it's not a big issue in the ESCO industry, and energy efficiency as such is commonly not considered a climate change activity by those that are working with energy efficiency. So I think that is the answer to that. It is a new thing, and that's what we're trying to bridge the gap here.
Thank you very much, Søren. Unfortunately, we don't have more time for more questions. It's been more than 60 minutes regarding the webinar. So thank you for the detailed responses to the questions to Frauke and Søren. And ladies and gentlemen, finally, we come to the end of the webinar. I would like to say thanks to, of course, the panelists for the informative and very interesting presentations, and to their audience for their participation. We hope that the presentation will be beneficial for all stakeholders involving in energy efficiency and ESCOs. Thank you for your attention and wish you a good day or night from Copenhagen.